Good morning, everyone. I believe we should be live. I'll just do a quick check and give some time for people to come in. Just check around, make sure I'm seeing what I'm seeing. All right, and we are alive. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here on today's live. Today, we're going to be talking about data engineering trends. We'll also maybe go over a few articles. So if anyone has any articles that they'd like to maybe see or go over, feel free to let me know or put them in the Discord. Probably would be the best place because I think YouTube sometimes blocks articles that get sent in chat. So I'm going to actually just put Discord here, and you can put them in the articles channel in there. So we'll talk about a few things. Let me just put this here. And yeah, so we can kind of get going. All right, so I want to talk about some of the trends that, I'm just seeing in general. So we'll talk about a few things such as like problems data teams are facing, data infra trends. So some of the places and ways I'm seeing people set up their infrastructure, and then maybe we'll go over a few articles that I think cover more about trends and things like that. So again, feel free to send some if you have some, because I'd love to see the articles you're reading right now. I think there's a ton worth covering, and yeah, thanks. Cool. So every year, or at least the last 2 years, I've been running a survey, to my audience. So obviously, it's specifically to my audience. So take that with a grain of salt. There will always be some level of bias there, since it's not a perfectly random sample. But I always ask, one of the questions I always ask is, what problems are you facing as a data team? Like, what are the biggest problems that you face? And honestly, the issues haven't changed that much since last year, and probably not for the last decade or more. The first problem that often I think gets brought up and biggest issue remains data quality. So this is actually a quote from someone. Someone actually said, team is understaffed and data quality is not monitored. So I think that remains the big issue that most companies are going to face. That constantly is the thing. And data governance, I think, and reliable data models, I think both kind of fit similarly into that. Like, obviously, they're not necessarily tied to data quality, but I think they have their connections. So reliable data models. Someone said there's too much bespoke data modeling resulting in complex DBT DAGs. So, because tools are easier, there's kind of this need for governance. Hiring remains hard, which I imagine at this point it's an interesting situation. On both sides, we're kind of in a point where every job that gets put out there, it feels like there's 1,000 people applying. Whether that's because people have automated systems now to just use like ChatGPT to write your cover letter and tailor a resume, essentially, just to send out 1 million of them. I think that's always been hard, but I think it's just getting harder again on both sides. Both getting hired and hiring the right talent, just because you're having to now wade through 1,000 resumes versus just 50 or 100 or so. Management, that comes up a few times. So that one was just a few different points here and there, where usually it was like management doesn't get the point of data, or maybe doesn't understand how to integrate data into strategy, or lacks vision and management, which I think in some cases isn't that abnormal. I think for some companies, data teams really are just kind of an accounting team where you're really just there to give them reports, and they don't want more than that. And it's hard to fight that. Some companies want to be, very data driven or very focused on, using data to drive more than just their reporting, but some just really want some reporting, and that's their goal. So it's a hard place to be. But if you understand that, and once you figure out, hey, my company is just never going to let me do more, then you can ask yourself if it's time to leave or not. I only saw this one come up a few times, the last one like 3 or 4 times, but I thought it was interesting, just because I think it is a problem in its own way, which is too many tools. I definitely have a lot of the work that I do even gets started with just the fact that people are like, we don't even know what tools to start with, right? Like I'm talking to very smart people who know data, who know how data should work, but they're very like, we have no idea where to even start because, like there's just so many options. They don't want to be wrong, and they don't want to invest $100,000 in the wrong direction. So that came up a few times, and I think that is a genuine problem that people face. Again, like just as a consultant, like the first month or two is often just discussing that, is trying to make sure that they're confident in the tools that they're going to pick moving forward. So what's going on in data infra? Obviously, there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot of companies kind of starting or trying to implement their own kind of standard. I think so. I saw someone in the comments reference Microsoft Fabric. I haven't had to take on a Microsoft Fabric project yet. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are doing it. Maybe that's more in the Accenture realm of things. I think one of the things that is outside of the Azure world that we're seeing a lot, and I put Iceberg here. You could put Hootie or Delta or whichever, but I definitely think we're seeing some people push for this storage anywhere, kind of approach where, hey, what if I just had my data externally managed, and then I could choose my compute engine, right? So I think that's a very interesting place that people are going towards, right? Like this gives you control maybe a little more on costs because you can kind of decide, hey, if I want to run Spark or a different solution on top of my data lake or data lakehouse, I can do that rather than only being allowed to use something like Snowflake on top of that. In fact, I was just having a conversation with a possible client the other day about this, where they're like, hey, this is what we'd like to do. We think this makes sense because we have some jobs that we'd like to run that from Databricks, and some jobs that we'd like to run from Snowflake, and some jobs that we'd like to run from EMR, because we have different teams, because we have different goals for those teams. How do you think about this approach? So I do think it's interesting seeing a lot of companies kind of take this a step further from like separating storage and compute in a single product, and now really trying to separate storage and compute into multiple solutions. I think the problem that a lot of them then face is that they're like, okay, how do I make sure that if I'm using something like an external table source, that I still get benefits if I want to like index data or improve performance? And so that's the next question. I think the other problem here is that you're putting more work more likely on yourself, right? Like the benefit of picking more of an all-in-one solution is that you have everything in one place. But if you end up going the route of separating storage and compute, you now have to manage more and more systems. Maybe someone comes out and they're like, hey, we've built like an indexing solution too, so you can stick that on top. It's interesting to see kind of this I guess evolution in the data infrastructure as people are trying to figure out, okay, what's next here in terms of like where my data should live and how should we process it. But people just have so many options. I mean, I think, oh no, Apache Flink is here, so Apache Flink's here. So there's so many options that people have that they want to kind of use on how they process data. So I think it's interesting, and you can look up this person's article here because this is not my image. It's a really nice image. I really liked it. Which then makes me always wonder, what do people prefer? Like, do people prefer all-in-one solutions versus putting together multiple solutions? I think you do tend to find a mix. Like, obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Some people do like maybe having choice. I don't think the thing of putting 5 solutions together is that they don't necessarily like want. They probably prefer all-in-one, but they want to have all-in-one with choice. So I think that's generally why people prefer maybe putting together multiple solutions. But I do think this all-in-one solutions continues to like have traction, right? Someone referenced in the meme here is essentially a reference to Databricks, because if you pick Databricks, you can kind of get your automated jobs. You can get a lot of this stuff in one space, which is obviously helpful for some people, but I imagine for others, And I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment. Do you guys prefer having everything all together? Do you guys prefer being able to like piecemeal together the right solution that you feel led to? But I'm definitely still seeing a mix of like what people's infrastructure looks like. I mean, I'll go into companies and they'll have like 3 different ETL tools, right? Like they'll be using Informatica and Azure Data Factory at the same time. Or they'll be, using their DBT, Airflow, plus, 2 different ingestion solutions. So it is interesting to see this. And this is, to say it's going one direction, I mean, it's going to really depend company on company, how they've set up their infrastructure. And for anyone, this unbundling picture I think was really popular. I want to say in like 2021 or 2022, it was like, oh, what are we doing? Are we just unbundling the Airflow? And I thought I really still like kind of what it was suggesting as people were trying to figure out kind of what infrastructure looks like going forward. Honestly, I still see people with Airflow as like their main solution, and like they don't use DBT, they just use SQL inside. So I do think people like maybe like 3 or 4 solutions. I don't think they like the idea of like 7 solutions is where I usually see people being like, this is ridiculous. We want one thing to maybe do some of these parts as a whole, more so. Another trend, like kind of with, I think, things like too many tools, the different types of ways you can set up tooling, all of that, I think the trends that you see there that people are trying to gather some control over is some level of FinOps. I think what's interesting with FinOps is it generally comes in at a specific step in the process. So like when I'm setting up data infrastructure for a company, especially from scratch, yeah, they want to know generally what's going to cost. But what usually ends up happening is you'll set up their infrastructure. It'll run around that cost for about 6 months or so. And then as people see like, hey, there's a data warehouse or there's a data lake house that exists, more and more people start getting on it. And more people want to start building on it. And more people want to start using it, right? Like as soon as you put it out into the world, people are like, oh, I don't have to use just Excel now. I can also like maybe build a more complex dashboard, or I have access to data that I've never had access to. Suddenly people are going to start like going into that and trying to automate different workflows, or maybe answer different questions that they haven't been able to answer for the last, 2 years. And then suddenly you see costs start to increase. And so generally somewhere after that, you'll see this influx where you have to figure out, okay, what jobs do we want? What workflows are good and what workflows do we not? So FinOps, is just a method of kind of doing that. I like that Joe Reese also brought this up in his recent 2024 article, which we'll look at here in the end. But just the fact that companies are looking, to make sure that like what they're spending on the cloud actually makes sense. I've had a lot of conversations where people are like, hey, we're spending, $100,000 a year. We're spending X million dollars on the cloud. Are we using this like the best we could, right? It's not just about, spending money. It's like, hey, we think we could honestly spend more money on the cloud, but are we being optimal with the money we are spending is kind of the way people are looking at it. It's less about just how much are we spending, but also are we being optimal with what we're spending? And I really kind of like this. I like that Joe Reese has brought that. And you see this even with data teams, like not just like technology, but I think companies are looking at their data teams and like, hey, we have, 100 people on this data team. Like, do we need them all? And making sure people are being optimal. So it's the classic do more with less. I think that's the one thing that I find sometimes frustrating, because I've talked to some people who, it's the classic, hey, they fired half our team, but they still expect us to do the same work. So I think that's different than, okay, you've laid off half the team because you didn't think half the work needed to get done. So I think that's a little bit frustrating for some of the conversations I've had. But yeah, I think people are definitely always looking at, costs and trying to figure out how do we optimize both technology and team size. So we'll kind of see how that goes into 2024, 2025. I think another thing that's always common is that people want to figure out how to share data, right? And if you've been in the data world for a while, I always like to say that, sharing data is kind of this laborious work, because one, if you want to do like often bulk sharing of data, so like a large set of data, you're going to do the classic, like, I'm going to write a query on my database, and then I'm going to take that and somehow automate it. I put lambdas here, but it could be, a cron job, an Airflow job, something. I'm going to automate that query that I have to then go tell some external partner, hey, this is the data that I'm going to send you. Are you good with that? That external partner, that you're actually sending the data to will be like, yeah, sure. I'll create a table on my side. Then you got to take that CSV, essentially push it, encrypt it, generally put it into a server somewhere, right, via SFTP. And then on the other side, they're going to unencrypt it and go through the whole process to do the opposite, which generally takes a long time. Not because it's complicated, right? Like, it's not hard to do, but like the constant conversations back and forth, making sure the schema stays the same, making sure you don't, make sure that the SQL query the person said they're going to build is what they built and is accurate. Like, I've had plenty of times where someone said like, hey, here's the data you should expect. And then they send me the data and it's not what I expected. Or maybe they ask you for data and you're like, I don't know if I have that data. Now I got to go look for half that data. So this tends to take a little bit of time. The other obviously option is, or popular option is like APIs. Not a lot of APIs are always built for large data exports. I think is one of the problems I sometimes find. Every once in a while, I'll come against an API that maybe has a limit after 10,000 records, so you can't do historic data pulls easily, or maybe it just is built to really only pull one like entity of data at a time. So you have to send out 100,000 data requests in order to extract data. So some APIs are just not built for it. And then I said email with a CSV because I've seen that as well, where it's like just a company is like, hey, we'll email this in a secure email, and you can set up like some automated script to pull it from that email. So, and I'm sure there's other ways that people use, but those are generally the ways I see. And there's a lot of problems in that. So I think that leads to a lot of companies like Snowflake. I mean, that's one example. There's plenty of other companies going to be doing some level of data sharing. I just think that the idea, and I'm seeing companies that I'm working with take it on and look for ways to do it, makes a lot of sense, because everyone still wants to share data. Like, I'm working with plenty of companies at this point that are either sharing data or having data sent to them in one way or the other. So finding ways to do that more easily and turn that into less of this like duplication of data where you're extracting and then reloading somewhere else, which causes lots of risk and problems, right? Like, especially if you're talking about like data with personal information in it, and then if someone asks for that data to be removed, right, like then technically you have to remove it from all of its locations. And if it's not shared, and if instead it exists just in your own data warehouse, then you have to set up a system on your side as well to remove that data, versus just having it be in a table and it just disappearing one day. So I definitely see a lot of that. And I think like companies like Snowflake are also looking at that. They just required, they're more of a clean room company, but kind of a similar idea, like where there's this data sharing kind of aspect to it. So I think there's a lot of companies looking at this and trying to figure out how do we make this easier. There's other like actual startups as well, like bobsled.co. I think it's a Harbor is kind of similar, although they're focused more on like data marketplace. But I think that's always interesting. I also see there's a lot of questions. Keep them coming, because I will look at those questions soon. I would love to kind of check this out. We'll take a break somewhere in the middle and do that, and then also we'll look at some articles if you have any. Okay, AI. I think it's hard to not talk about AI in this world, because we're all curious, like, will AI take our jobs? I mean, on one side, I have a hard time answering that question, not because it's just in 5 years, who knows, right? Like, maybe it'll get stalled out. Maybe AI will take some time to get better. I can tell you there are times that I've saved plenty of hours of my own time where it's like, oh, I could write this script, or I could see if ChatGPT or Copilot could do it. And 60% of the time, maybe not 60%, maybe 40% of the time, it does it decently well. I still maybe have to change it, but it is doing it to a point where it's like, hey, yeah, like I kind of just asked it to do it, and now I saved myself an hour by just taking this 5 minutes to ask something else to do it. I think that the biggest thing that I have with that is I still want to know how to code. And I feel like if you start asking something else to do it, you risk maybe turning off some part of your brain in the future that now you're just like, oh, I'll just, use my Copilot to do this instead. So again, I do that survey again, that survey with my audience. I forgot to mention, we had about 600 people fill it out this year, which thank you for everyone who did. It just gives me a good idea of like, hey, have things changed? It's the second year, so not much has changed, I don't think, other than AI being a big part of things. So I asked, obviously, the question, are you utilizing LLMs or generative AI outside of Copilot? Because I was like, look, I mean, Copilot, yeah, I'm sure most companies have likely decided that either to use a Copilot or something that, as long as it's like secure, or maybe some companies have completely banned it because they're worried, obviously, and I think validly, that an API key will show up somewhere. But yeah, I think that was something that I asked, and 65% of the respondents said outside of that, they are not using, they don't have any plans. They don't have like any projects that they're trying to use to implement it anywhere. So there is still kind of this like, hey, what do we do with it? I think kind of in this space, but there was a decent amount of people that did, right? Like 35% of people did say like, hey, yeah, we are trying to implement a Copilot or some sort of generative AI into our process. So someone referenced automated data analysis with ChatGPT, which I'd be interested to know what the outputs are, because I feel like that's still a little new, but maybe it's doing something. Maybe it's just part of it. Customer support, I think we've seen that a lot, right? Like that's the Klarna example. For those who don't know, Klarna has supposedly like reduced their staff by a few hundred people, or not reduce their staff. We're basically able to take care of the same amount of work as a certain number of their staff because of essentially using generative AI. Summarizing survey responses, I think that makes sense. So like a lot of search or like summarization, automatically answering help tickets, which again, kind of similar. And that's what I can definitely see. I think things like your ChatGPTs and things improving people's workflows, just because currently chatbots and the people the automated phone bot that you get back, I think you kind of get a similar kind of quality where it's like it's not great. So yeah, if they want to improve those things that are automated anyways, I think those are good. But those were generally the consensus of answers. So it is hard to answer like, hey, will AI take your job? I mean, in 5 years, the tech world changes drastically. I imagine, at least in the next 5 years, we'll be continuing the way we kind of are, which is figuring out where it fits, figuring out what it's good at, figuring out, is it cost efficient? Is it effective? Like I think someone pointed out that the times with like Devin, they were like looking at how long it took Devin to do certain things currently was very long. So maybe that's not a great choice currently. So I think probably for the next 5 years, we'll probably be in a similar state, and then unless there's a massive move forward, which I think is the harder thing to say. Like, hey, if there's an exponential, piece of growth that happens, something could happen that completely shifts my belief in saying like, okay, it's down to 1 year or 2 years. But currently, if it's linear, I imagine we'll stay on the current trajectory where we'll still be figuring it out. We'll still figure out where it works. It'll still be kind of buggy and not perfect when it writes code, but it'll definitely write, like from my experience, it definitely writes good, like, simple scripts pretty okay. Like if you're asking it to do a simple thing, it does it great. Once I start trying to ask more complex things, like I've had some logic and things like that I've tried to implement, just testing it, it usually can't handle it. And then I'm like, all right, it's just faster for me to write it. So that's usually how I feel. All right. But please feel free to ask more specifics on AI. No code and abstractions. I think this is always something interesting to me. There's always been no code. There's always been abstractions, right? Like if you've been around the data world, SSIS has been around for a very long time. I still see, obviously, people trying to figure out which ones I think they prefer. I think that's the big thing. I think some data teams just prefer things to be, no code. They're like, hey, look, we're aren't programmers, we want no code, we want something to be drag and drop, or we have like SQL skills and we want things to be drag and drop. Or on the other side, it's like, hey, we have a system, we need to be able to scale it. We need to be able to like configure it our own way. So we want to use something open source and maybe more abstracted like Airflow or something similar in terms of those choices. So I think that's generally what I see people kind of doing here is like they don't want to obviously build things from scratch. I think hopefully you're no longer trying to build your own orchestrator or data pipeline tool 100% from scratch. It might make sense early on, obviously, if you're just building very simple jobs to use something like Lambda or just some scripts. But eventually, as you need more complex systems, I think it does make sense just to use something out of the box. There are tons of options these days. The question then just becomes, do you want something that's like code abstracted, like Airflow, where it's like, hey, some of it's kind of done for you. Some of it's, some of it you're going to have to put in there in terms of writing your own code. Or do you want to do something that's like low code or no code or drag and drop? And I think that's still company dependent. I find some people just prefer one or the other. I've seen recently some people take some shots at Airflow, and I think the reason people like code is because it is easier in terms of like complex manipulation to do, right? Drag and drop can feel limiting. As soon as I need to do something more complex, and if I go into the drag and drop world, sometimes you feel stuck, whether that's true or not, right? Like if I have to figure out something that I could do what feels like in 2 minutes on the code side, that now I'm stuck on the no code side, I'll be frustrated and just want to go back to writing things myself. Okay, so I'm going to take a few questions here. I mean, there's definitely a lot of other stuff going on, so feel free to ask questions, data engineering or otherwise. And then, I'll also look at a few articles here in a second. How do you call it? Clean room? Yeah, so clean rooms, I think, generally refer to, so there's like data sharing, and then there's like this aspect of like, hey, but can we like kind of share data, but like it takes care of more of like privacy and security, and we think more thoroughly on like, hey, we want to be able to join maybe our two data sets that have customer data in it, but we don't want to know like your customer data information specifically, and we want it to kind of be clean, and we kind of want to have like privacy more on the forefront of how we share data. We want to be like a little more cognizant of that. So data clean room, you can kind of look that up. Do the career of a data engineer is under threat due to tools driven with AI? What's your perspective on? I'm a beginner and curious about your thoughts. Like I kind of referenced earlier with AI, it's in the current world, I don't think so. But if something happens, if some new breakthrough happens the next year that completely shocks everyone, where it's like, yeah, no, that really does write code fast. And handles more complex problems, because I think that's always the thing I've run into with copilots is like, as soon as I have an actual hard problem, it just doesn't do what I want it to do. In that case, I think you're fine. But yeah, in terms of like simple scripts, that's stuff that I do see it doing decently well. But even there, like I don't see it being where like someone can like ask ChatGPT to write a script and then they're going to implement it into production. Like we are very far, I think, from that world. I don't think people trust it enough, nor should they. Like it's worse. Like it'd be worse almost to me than like copying code from GitHub and just hoping that it runs. So I think there's plenty of like discernment that needs to happen there. I've been learning databases, but I think I'm stuck. What can I do to break the loop? As I know Python, SQL, and what type of project can I make? I mean, if you're stuck in terms of like databases, I mean, I think the best thing is to try to build a project with a database of your choice, whatever, MySQL, Postgres, that is slightly more complex. So try to ingest multiple sources. Try to then integrate multiple sources. So try to find some data sources that are maybe somewhat connected, where you have to actually go through the process of figuring out how you can connect them. I think would be interesting. Let's see. Remember that many mid-large companies will take years to adopt, technology. In my opinion, if you build a good core like SQL and additional language like Python, others, you're fine. Yeah, that's kind of how I view it as well. I appreciate that. Like, that's why I say like 5 years, I think we're going to be about where we're at, because I have companies right now that are still adopting the cloud, right? They're still migrating to the cloud. That is probably still a third or maybe a quarter of the projects that I take on. And we're talking, the cloud has been out for, technically since like 2006, I think was when AWS started selling the cloud, but whatever, more popularly, maybe in the 2010 era. So we're talking about 15 years later, people are still not moved. And even enterprises. And so I wouldn't worry too much. Like, it takes time for anyone to make changes. Again, unless there's like some exponential change where someone's like, hey, we now have a thing that you can click a button and everything changes. But generally that's not how it works. So I'm not confident that's where we're going. I'm a Power BI developer at present, but I want to move into data engineering. The number of articles and guides are overwhelming. Yeah, it's funny now. It's like we need just a guide on the guides. How do I really get started apart from learning SQL and Python? I mean, obviously, learn SQL and Python, but then pick like things that you like topics, and build a project is going to always be the best way, right? Pick something that you're interested in. And then what's great is you're a Power BI developer. So pick some dashboard that you want to build and then build it. Pick some sources and then build it. I'm interested in learning data engineering, but it seems like the market is saturated. Is it really saturated? What will be the next 10 years of data engineering? I think the hard thing is the market always feels saturated, right? Like, especially if you're just breaking in. I think we're also in a weird time where there was a massive amount of layoffs from tech last year. So a lot of these positions, maybe there's a lot of people fighting for them, is the way I feel. So if you're new, it's definitely a little more challenging. And it's always been challenging. I think this iteration definitely is even further. So it feels like, because I'm hearing plenty of people struggle. I think there's still a lot of jobs. I think it's just, there's a lot of people fighting for those jobs currently. So that's kind of where I'm feeling. I still think it's worth it. I think it is going to be much harder, and you need to have something more than, you can't just apply to jobs. Like if you're applying to 1,000 jobs, that's you're gambling. You're basically gambling and hoping you have like a 1 in 10,000 shot for a lot of other people. All right, I'm going to take maybe a few more questions, and then I'll start going through Joe Reese's article and some other articles. Do you think it will still be common to go from data analyst, analytics engineer, data engineer, or are data engineers positions becoming more like software engineer positions, i.e. more CS heavy? In my experience, like people with the role data engineer, it still is kind of this split with data engineer and analytics engineer. Like some companies have a clear split where like we have analytics engineers, but I don't think like a company like Facebook has that yet, right? But you could argue that their data engineers is kind of this interesting, like slightly less technical than maybe a Netflix data engineer position. So I don't think like analytics engineer is relatively new. So like the fact that like that's in the process is newer. I think a lot of people just go from data analyst to data engineer. If they do go from somewhere, if you have a CS background, I do think that makes you often more like hireable. Like people will look at that more than they would at maybe other degrees. But that the whole like CS heavy, I imagine we'll kind of go through another like iteration of like, we're making it more complex. I feel like right now in terms of like data infrastructure, I think we'll simplify it over the next few years, and then then it'll be more like what it is, maybe what you're thinking of it, less tech heavy, and then we'll figure out some other new technology, and it'll get more complex again. And I think that's generally how that wave goes. Is data engineering an entry-level job, or would it make more sense to get experience as data analyst first? Yeah, generally, I do see a lot of people just go the data analyst route first. I just noticed that trend, that there's a lot of people who are like, hey, I wanted to be a data engineer. I couldn't get that position, so I got a data analyst position, and made sure I worked really closely with the data engineering team, or made sure I was like connected with them and trying to understand data warehousing, so I could kind of eventually move it and have that conversation. So I do see that a lot, where people like have to kind of get there because data engineering is so broad. I don't think, I think that's what I often see is it is so broad that like they expect a lot. They expect a lot of skills, and you kind of have to have time building those skills, and you need those skills kind of built on the job. Yeah, I mean I think this is the truth. Like the market's just really terrible for any job. Like it's data engineering, data science, software engineering. I mean, I'm sure even beyond that, marketers are all probably dealing with this to a degree. If you had to get started with a cloud, which would you pick? I probably would start with AWS, but AWS and Azure both have a pretty good market share. But personally, I just like AWS. AWS, cloud, IBM, Azure. Which would you start with? I'm a data scientist. Analytics would want to pivot to DE. Yeah, I think, like I just said, AWS is probably solid, and it shows you have a decent background. There's a lot of people as AWS learning a game changer for an IT career. I don't think it's a game changer, right? But like you will need to know it, right? Like it's expected. All right, let me pull up. I wonder if I can just change this. So we kind of talked a little bit about what I'm seeing, and honestly, I like looked at Joe Reese's article too, and there were some things that I already covered that he has said. So for people who haven't read Joe Reese, he's the fundamentals of data engineering. He has a newsletter, so you guys can actually go check it out on Substack. Not sponsored, just he's we're friends. He kind of referenced some of the similar things, right? He referenced continued tooling abstraction, which I think we're always trying to simplify what we can. But I always find that there are little pieces in between the process, or maybe if a company has a more or a system that's required to be scaled out more, that abstractions may or may not be fully scaled out towards that. Like at Facebook, I think my team alone had like 10,000 DAGs or so that we were managing, and some of that probably could have just been thrown away. It's just years and years and years of people building things, but they had a system that was essentially Airflow that scaled to it, and I think that's the real challenge. It's one challenge to like write code. It's another challenge to like scale out to those things. Some of these systems may or may not do that, and I find that mix. As long as the system I think was built with scale, like there's a few that I think are, that can handle larger data sets. I've definitely handled larger data sets with Estuary. I've definitely tried to think of other places I've handled larger data sets with or more complex problems with. Not an abstraction or a tool, but BigQuery Omni I've used to manage larger data sets and push that around. So there are some systems that can, but it's something to think about. He also had Finops, which I thought was interesting. I quoted him, so I just quoted him from this article because I thought that was interesting. The resurgence of enterprise data practices. I think that's something that we are starting to see more, right? Like we kind of went through this period of time where people kind of built a little more freely. They were like, okay, we just want to deliver, we want to deliver. We have these teams, we have these tools now, right? Like whatever it is, DBT. Someone referenced that if you recall earlier in this whole conversation, they referenced that like DBT models have kind of gotten out of control. So kind of this like, let's put some governance, let's put like something around what we're doing to make sure that we're not just building for the sake of building, but let's build things that will last. Let's set up some level of governance as we're putting in these data models to ensure we're not just building a million dashboards that go nowhere. And so I think that's something that we're constantly seeing kind of getting rehashed. And every company's on their own journey. Like some company's going to go into they're going to first get DBT, they're going to start using it, it's going to be great. Then eventually it just explodes, and now they have 10,000 models, and no one owns any of them. And then they're like, okay, we need to like bring this back. And so I do think there's a little bit of an ebb and flow, but I think people are starting more with this in mind, like this resurgent. I just had a conversation with someone the other day where they're like, hey, what are the ways we can get screwed by, we've picked DBT, we're using it. What are the ways we can get screwed? So they're already kind of thinking about it. I think going forward, they're like, we read articles, we know that like one of the problems is things can kind of explode. So I think the fact that there's more content out there talking about that and talking about those issues is helping people kind of figure out, how to balance that. Like, okay, we can't just post this and read this. Or use these without thinking. So I think that's kind of a thing. Let's see. Actually, I haven't read this section yet, so I'm going to take a second here. Let's see. Every company seems to want AI, whatever that means. When I dig into actual AI use cases that can move the needle, stuff like GitHub Copilot comes to mind as a gateway drug from for many companies to get value from AI. It's like staffing. Yeah, it's like staffing your engineering team with interns and junior level engineers who are super convincing and often their code reworked. But for the most part, the code output is passable or at least eventually usable. There's a catch. I don't expect AI-enabled workflows to replace handwritten code anytime soon, as engineers still prefer writing code. Engineers want to engineer. I think I love this. Like the engineers want to engineer. That goes back to my point about like Airflow, low-code solutions, like why people pick certain solutions. I mean, at the end of the day, an engineer wants to engineer. Like you spent 4 years of your life maybe or more learning how to code, going through college. I guess in college it wasn't 4 years. I think probably a year or two was actual coding. But you spent a good amount of time like learning how to code and thinking this is what you want to do and convincing yourself that like, this is your job. And then whenever anyone comes to you and they're like, hey, just use drag and drop, it kind of like kills you a little. I think that's something that if you do sell drag and drop solutions or no code solutions, like it's worth, or low code solutions, it's worth considering that like engineers want to build. So, and also this whole like, I love the like super convincing, but needs to be reworked. Cause like, yeah, like what I often find is that like, hey, it'll be like, hey, here's the code. It works great. And that kind of does give that vibe of like, when your junior level engineers come to you, like I've figured it out, and you're like, well, let me look at it, and you're like, well, I kind of does it. Let's rework a few things here, but yeah, no, I see what you're saying. It's passable. So yeah, I think he's got a good take here, and I also like the fact that he references the fact that every company wants to use AI because every company wants to use AI. They don't know what they want to use it for. So no, I think it's a lot of good takes here. Let's see. Upskilling, leveling up. That's something else I imagine. So let's see. I'm seeing a lot of interest in data teams leveling up their competencies and skills. Data engineering is pretty new. It's a pretty new job title, and there's yet no standardized training for data engineers. Random and scattered skill sets are the norm for most data engineering teams. At most companies, there's often no official playbook for how to work as a data engineer. For a framework, nor a framework for how data engineers should function within their company. Yeah, so I think this is something also like where this is going. I also kind of agree with like there's always this need to kind of level set and figure out what exactly do data engineers need to be doing at every company that I really appreciate he's kind of calling out here. Yeah, data engineering is still relatively new. It's a little over a decade old, maybe. Like the title itself, obviously the work we've been doing is several decades old, but like the function and how it kind of applies, I think is different. So I think that's kind of an interesting take here. And then yeah, I like the fact that it's like this scattered skill set. I remember when I worked at Facebook, like my manager is like, well, I came from like he had like an English degree, but like had been doing a lot of like Linux and like networking, setting up early on in his career, and then eventually kind of moved into like data engineering through over time. So there often is like you'll find like there's this interesting mix of skills that kind of come from into the data engineering world where people just come from different backgrounds completely. So that's why I when someone asked earlier, like, should I have a CS degree? It's like, well, it'll probably make things easier, but honestly, the skill set, you just have to learn so much on the job that it'll matter less after a few years. Let's see. This one I haven't read either. So let's see. Introduce me to a defense and offense playbook for data. The offense playbook focuses on activities that add value, while the defense playbook is about building robust systems. All too often, data engineering teams focus on defense. This seems to be changing as data engineers work more closely with the business, which is where offense is key. Again, this is part of data engineering maturing as a field and adding value to the business. 2024 seems okay. So I think this is going to kind of close out this whole newsletter here. But yeah, both exciting and important for data engineers. But yeah, solid point here. I think the problem with us as engineers is we kind of are very inward focused. And so we often try to build these really, really good systems. So it's kind of this interesting mix. Like at some companies, you have people very connected, I think, to the business, and they're just outputting, Airflow and DBT or, writing SQL and building views on views. And then that becomes chaos. Or on the other side, you have engineering teams who maybe have gone through that or maybe have read about that. And so their response is to then build a ton of like really robust infrastructure and take all this time to build things, which is good. But if it takes too much time, right, then eventually you never actually go to the business and say like, hey, what do you need? What do you need that I'm doing? So I think that's kind of an interesting point there. Just adding a little more color to it. I'm going to see if there's some more questions. Oh, I just realized I've had this question up this whole time. Well, at least it told me where the last question was. So I'm going to go through a few more questions and then maybe we'll see what time it is after that. Let's see. There's a lot of questions. In one of your videos, you mentioned that you started freelancing. So let's see. I feel like I've answered several questions from you. This is at least a good question. So basically the question is, the person wants to know, is there a difference between PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and MySQL? And so obviously there are some big differences, like as you go through, especially like on the like more infrastructure level. Like this is minor, but like when I was going through Oracle, I was doing an Oracle and SQL Server migration. The example I always give is the fact that you could actually configure how nulls get ordered. So do nulls get ordered to the top or do nulls get ordered at the bottom when you say order by and say descending or ascending? And so when we migrated, the Oracle database was configured to set them, I think, to the bottom. And then the SQL Server were set to set them to the top. And so we had to kind of deal with that. So there are distinct differences between all of these, but they all operate somewhat similarly. Like these specific ones, right? Like Snowflake is different. So same with Databricks. Like Databricks really isn't a database in the traditional way. Neither is really Snowflake when you really look at it. But these three systems, I say like, yeah, I mean, they're close enough. Like as long as you can write SQL, you're gonna have different flavors of SQL in between all three. I think all three are slightly different flavors. But overall, you're gonna feel like it's the same thing. Like there's some different words. Like I think Oracle uses the term schema. I'm trying to remember. I think they use that instead of the word database. But there's like some weird one-off choices of words. But you're really like it's all databases. There's gonna be differences. But like if you've learned one, you should be able to pick up the next one. And that's part of like the tech world. So. Would you start off by reading the fundamentals of data engineering or designing data-intensive applications? If you're going for data engineer, I'd say read the fundamentals of data engineering. Like designing data-intensive applications is interesting. It covers a lot of great topics about like how big data works and things like that. But I think the FTE, as I'll just call it here, I think that just really covers a lot of stuff that you're gonna find valuable. So that's what I'd say. Like if you're going for a data engineer, FDE is definitely more of the first book to read. If you're more interested in learning just like technology and like how big tech works and like going through indexes and things like that, that's more where you're going to read the DDIA. Someone asked about DuckDB. I still haven't run into people using DuckDB, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Like someone's asking, will DuckDB grow and impact data engineering analytics? I mean, you're fighting to use it in every pipeline. Maybe I haven't had to use it in any pipeline, right? Like, but I'm sure there are great use cases for it. Just means I don't have a use case for it. But yeah, I'm sure it has its space. Other than all the skills mentioned to become a D, what are the few things or projects that can help stand out? So, with projects, I think part of it, like I wrote a whole article about like how you can start your own data engineering project. Generally, what I'll tell most people is like you need to find a data source, right? Something that you like. Like there's APIs out there, or maybe you can scrape something. And then you need to figure out how you're going to display it, right? Like you can figure out all the middle stuff later, but figure out an interesting way of displaying it. A dashboard is one way. That's like the basic way. But like if you can find a fun way to do it, do that, right? Like if you could build a website that maybe aggregates or summarizes data from somewhere, and data can be words, right? So like maybe your podcast you listen to and there are thousands of words, and instead you create some sort of system to aggregate or call out the interesting points in that podcast and then share that with people. That's an interesting kind of approach. So making it more functional and not just analytical. Let's see. Any suggestions for breaking in the industry? Any suggestions for breaking in the industry? I've had Microsoft DEA certificate for 2 years and Solid SQL. If you mean data engineering in general, and if you've already been working as a data analyst, I always recommend people try to kind of move laterally into these positions if they can at a company. And if you can't, start applying around. I think that's probably the best way. If you have to, obviously, you can start looking for referrals as the next thing, and then also building a project is kind of the next thing there. Let's see. I'm learning Informatica now. Is it worth to learn or move to Snowflake better? I mean, Informatica is more of the ETL-ish and data management, or not data management, but like data movement type tool. It's still heavily used. I think it will be for a long time. If that's what you want to build on, it's worth doing. But there's going to be plenty of other tools. Obviously, that's the hard thing. It's like there's too many tools. Let's see. If I'm a fresher, should I learn Hadoop first, or can I go straight to Azure Snowflake? You probably can start skipping Hadoop. This is somewhat dependent where you live, because I do notice that certain jobs in certain countries still heavily rely on things like Hadoop. But overall, I think people are trying to move away from that just because it's generally cost prohibitive in terms of like time, and it takes more time to build. Like I still see people have Hadoop, but I think people are trying to move more to abstractions of that. Should a senior engineer include personal projects on the resume if there are certain skills that senior data engineer never used in the real work but required by the next employer? I think it's one way, but I think at the same time, like unless it's like really like unless you can show it off like at a senior engineer level, maybe just reference that you have the skill, but it's probably not as important to reference personal projects. Yeah, if you use Redshift, this is a good point. Certain things can't handle JSON. I think, unless you're talking about Redshift itself, I think Postgres can handle JSON. I remember it had some ability to do something with objects. I haven't had to do that in a little bit, but I remember using it for someone was using it more complex. Because I remember occasionally at Facebook, I'd pull things from the MySQL database, and they'd have more complex objects stored, whether we wanted them or not. Like a Snowflake is like a filling system that uses a SQL, kind of, yeah. Like it's got kind of just a data storage layer that you then put compute on top. What tools are important for data quality and data security? I think this is always interesting because like a lot of people I think tend to build this stuff custom. There are solutions that exist, like Great Expectations for data quality, but a lot of people just still to this day, I think, build out a lot of custom solutions. Data security wise, in theory, your database should be part of that process. There's like, I'm not sure of any tools off the top of my head that do like data tracking, like people who like actually track where and how data is used. But data security in theory should be managed by like database and like, your IAM policies and things like that. That tends to be where security gets implemented. And maybe that's what you're referencing here, Edward. How important is it to understand Spark infrastructure? I mean, I think it's always good to understand how things are built, right? Like maybe you don't have to ever use Hadoop, but understanding MapReduce and how it, like its role that it played in data at the time, I think is valuable. Same thing with Spark. I think there's like valuable lessons to learn from its infrastructure and how it's set up, but the goal I think for companies at this point is not to create more complexity, but is to like make it simpler, right? So I think at this point with Spark, it's going to get more and more abstracted from this point on, and that's what I'd imagine. I mean, yeah. So someone's asking if AI can automate the pipeline creation, then data engineering jobs in the future will be less, right? Or different. I like maybe we can finally focus on data modeling. Finally, I don't think we're at a point right now where they're automating data pipelines well. So yeah, I see lots of examples, but I don't think I've seen anything done well. Like I think like Joe Reese put it, like it's kind of like a junior engineer. Like they'll do it, but you always have to go back and do more and add. Actually, I remember this tweet. Someone tweeted something where they're like, "Oh, like I don't remember who it was, whether it was like the person who wrote clean code or something." And they were like, "Oh, I just realized, I used like Copilot for the first time, and I realized that it makes like 90% of my work worth 0.1% of what it was, and 10% of my work now like 10,000 times as valuable." So I really think that that last little bit is going to always be hard, but maybe something will happen and surprise us all. Is Airflow getting old? Do you see tools like Prefect and Mage rising up in the scene for a more simplified orchestration tool? It's surprising because like Airflow isn't that old, right? Like in tech speak, I guess it is old, but like it's 10 years since it's been public about. I think 2015 was when it came out. But I do see a lot of these tools like Prefect and Mage kind of taking on a different approach, right? Like they're really just trying to say like, hey, how can we improve this? And they've had 10 years of like looking at Airflow, and we've all used it for 10 years, and we love it and we hate it, Airflow. And I think it'll stick around because it's been used so heavily, but I do think people will start slowly trying to chip at it, and it makes sense. Let's see. So Edward answering question. Let's see. I'm just curious what Leo said here. I think Airflow will be adopted over time. Mage and all the others. Definitely a good amount of marketing, but yeah. Oh, someone said, what's your opinion on Palantir Foundry? I think it's the most advanced Fabric Lakehouse platform in the market. I haven't used it for the last, I think, 2 years. It felt similar to, a lot of their terminology that they use feels similar to the way, like, I think you're referencing like us here. Like it seemed like they wanted to have different terminology for the same things that we're already doing. Building some sort of data model. In fact, I was talking to a friend who uses it heavily. And we were talking about like the same problems that you face in Snowflake and in Databricks. It's kind of the same problems you face with Palantir, which is like you have to still make sure your data is modeled correctly in order to take advantage of everything else that Palantir has on with it, right? Like you can't just stick it on the data and be like, it's going to work. It's like, no, you have to go through the time to make sure, the way you set up the data is still correct to take full advantage of it. But it is definitely like a very like all-in-one solution, more so than I think most of the other tools. Someone has quick page, 1 page or 2 page resume. I mean, I think to some degree, no one's looking at your resume like after a certain point. I mean, someone will, but like 1 or 2 page. If it takes 2 pages, it takes 2 pages. But yeah, a lot of that stuff's just going to go into an automated system, and hopefully someone looks at it. Oh, it's already 9 a.m. I'll probably start closing down here and start getting on with my day. I'm sure everyone else has other things to do, but hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you guys learned a few things, or at least ask good questions here. Someone asked why learning Docker is important for data engineer. It can be. So like Docker, there are a lot of solutions that we use that maybe you have to spin up via Docker, like Airflow. Some people like, especially if you're doing a lot of open source work and you don't have a DevOps team, you might have to know Docker. That's why it's kind of this interesting technology where it's like, in theory, you should have a DevOps team that maybe manages some of this, or an infrastructure team. Maybe not DevOps, I shouldn't put it on them. An infrastructure team, a platform team that's managing all this. But not every company does. So then if you want to use things like Airflow at scale, you might have to know some of these solutions. Again, we're kind of getting close here on time. Someone asked this, like, how do you decide if you should build your data info or buy? I'm going to answer this question hopefully in a in another live I'm going to do here, I think next week. But that's for I do a little bit through my newsletter. So if you're a paying subscriber, you'll get invited to that one. Oh no, it's not next month. Let me just share my newsletter. So if you are interested and if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, You can sign up here. I'm going to start closing this down. It is 9 o'clock. So this was a good set of questions. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. Let me know if you guys want more of these, maybe specific ways, specific topics. Feel free to either comment below or comment here in the chat. I'll lose those, so preferably comment below if you have more of these that you'd like to see in the future on specific topics. With that, guys, thank you so much for joining this live. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day.